Welcome to the University of Manitoba Alumni and Friends Virtual Learning for Life series, our 7th session of a total of 9 weeks. My name is Tracy Bowman, and I'm the Director of Alumni Relations and a proud alumna, and will be the moderator for today. Thank you for joining us and making this event part of your day, and in general, for choosing to stay connected with your alma mater. We've been able to offer this program free of charge to all of our 145,000 alumni living in 140 countries around the world, thanks to the very generous sponsorship of one of our affinity partners, IA Financial. Many thanks to them. Delivering learning for life opportunities is a very important role for the University of Manitoba, and we are so proud that we are able to showcase many of our leading professors and researchers in this way. So just a few housekeeping details before we begin. You're viewing this webinar on a YouTube link, and you will be able to see both our presenter and the power presentation at the same time. Today's session, like the others, is being recorded and will be posted to our website in the next day or two. You were also sent a link to Slido and a password. So a reminder, that website is www.sli.do, and the password, the code is VL17. So we will be using that for the Q&A, but we will also be using it during the presentation, as there is one poll question. So I encourage you to have that either as a second window on your website browser, or if you have another device like a phone or a tablet around that you're not viewing this session on, perhaps going to that as well, as we would like to see your engagement with that poll. So during the Q&A, I, as the moderator, will be looking at your questions, and I will be asking them of our speaker verbally, and we will try to get through as many as we're able to. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Suzanne Gagnon, who will be presenting on crisis leadership observations for a new model. Dr. Gagnon is the Canada Life Chair in Leadership Education, an Associate Professor in Leadership and Organization with the Asper School of Business, and the Director of the James W. Burns Leadership Institute. Her research focuses on identity dynamics and leadership development in international firms, emergent and collective leadership, and its links to organizational change and strategy in both private and public sector organizations, and on social diversity and equality in business organizations. So with that, over to you, Dr. Gagnon.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to now share my screen with you. And I am hoping that everyone can see it. Tracy, could you give me a yes? Can everyone see my screen? I need a little yes. Chris or Teddy?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much, Tracy, for that introduction. And it really is a pleasure to be here. And, you know, this topic, leadership and crisis, is extremely timely. We are experiencing a global crisis in some sense. And one of the questions I'll be asking today is, what is different about this crisis, and what does it teach us about how we need to think about leadership? And that may well apply to other cases as well going forward. So I'll be sharing some of the new theory around the new thinking from some leadership scholars, as well as my own take on this question. But I'm going to ease into our topic by asking addressing some questions at the moment. So what is crisis, and what makes this crisis different? So we've had really, you know, serious and all-encompassing crises before. I think of hurricanes like Katrina. I think of the global financial crisis in 2008. It really had, you know, these were really extremely important crises in some sense. So what makes the pandemic different? Well, scholars are starting to think about crisis as a puzzle versus crisis as a mystery. And if we think of crisis as a puzzle, this has well-defined rules, and there is a single solution. Even if we don't know the answer yet, We know it exists. It's a puzzle. You can put the pieces together. A mystery, on the other hand, is imbued with vagueness or indeterminacy. And so all leaders can do, or one thing they can do, is frame it. So they have to identify the critical factors and also learn from the past and, try to discern the solution to the mystery over time. But these elements of mystery really hamper decision-making. They make it much more difficult. So when we think of the early days of the pandemic, leaders all around the world were thinking about, how bad will it be? What are its parameters? There's a lack of reliable information. And even now we are lacking some information. We didn't have an understanding of the economic consequences. So leaders really had to act and make decisions in conditions of what some call radical uncertainty. Now, of course, this isn't a watertight distinction in terms of COVID, because once we have a vaccine, a big part of the puzzle will be solved. But in these, even now, a couple of months in, we really are in a situation where there are more, many more questions and high uncertainty. So what about leadership? So I'm thinking of the elements of crisis from the perspective of leadership. For some years now, we've been thinking about leadership, if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, as an activity. It's a practice. It's a set of behaviors. Instead of, in an older, more traditional way, which was thinking of leadership as a set of traits or solely a position in an authority structure. So leadership is not limited to those things. And one thing I'm going to argue today is that thinking of it as an activity or practice or a set of behaviors actually helps us to get closer to understanding the kind of leadership that is needed in a crisis. So I'm going to ask you, just drawing on my contrast between traits and practices on the last slide, which of the following traits is most important for a leader during crisis? And this is a bit of fun, so you don't have to take it too seriously, but Tracy's opening the poll, and I'd like to see what you think about this question. Tracy and Ted, I'm assuming that I'm going to see the answers on my phone as well. I see 21 responses, but I don't see the answer yet. Could you,
Suzanne, for some reason, you're not able to see them, but I can see them, so I can start to share these results with you. So right now, we're at 29% saying being able to see the future and 71% saying none of the above. Nobody has selected the first three.
Okay, thank you.
24 respondents so far.
Thank you, Tracy. So I'm going to move on, but thanks everybody for engaging in this. And so 21% said D and 73% said E, or something around that. So that's fantastic. If we were thinking of leadership as a set of traits, we may have said, being extroverted helps a leader deal with a crisis, helps a leader to lead others during crisis. Believe it or not, not that long ago, a few decades ago, being tall was thought of as being an important thing to have, an important trait to be an effective leader. And there's actually theory on this, like from the 50s and 60s. It's pretty interesting. Having an advanced degree, so we just threw that in there, and being able to see the future, so clairvoyance. And I guess on the point of clairvoyance, really, who can see the future, right? So absolutely, if we could see the future, that would be a great trait to have, but we can't. We don't have that capability. So I think that those of you who answered E, I agree with all of you. D and E are the answers, but D, unfortunately, is just unrealistic. So traits are not a useful way to think about leadership, and certainly not only traits. It's much more important to think about practices, what leaders do. So an older model of leadership in crisis may have considered people like Superman. So he's the hero, he's going to come in and solve our problems. Or Jean-Luc Picard from Star Trek, the patriarch, the friendly, benevolent patriarch, who again is going to really solve our problems. But what's the new image of leadership for crisis? And so I'm going to show you a short clip about Bonnie Henry, who's the Chief Public Health Officer in British Columbia. And let's listen to how she deals with the early stages of the crisis. What kind of leadership is she
taking in the early stages? Day after day, Dr. Henry has been out front, guiding British Columbians with facts.
Yeah, the risk still remains very low.
Humor.
Wash your hands like you've been chopping jalapenos and you need to change your contacts.
And compassion.
I went through SARS. I've been through Ebola. I've been through the pandemic in 2009. And I just know how stressful it is for our healthcare system, for my colleagues, and for families.
Yesterday, she announced some significant changes.
We are advising British Columbians against all non-essential travel outside of Canada. We are directing all event organizers in British Columbia that they will be required to cancel any gatherings larger than 250 people.
I spoke to Dr. Henry earlier today and started by asking about the sudden increase in restrictions.
It really came down to feeling that the changing situation globally, the changing risk, that it would be better to go too soon than too late. And if we went too late and didn't protect people, we would never be able to recover from that.
Whoops, I'm sorry. I'll just see if I can turn that off and go to my next. Whoops. All right. So, what I would propose to you, if we think about Dr. Henry and some of what she was doing in that short clip, we saw that she was using facts, she was using humor, she was using compassion. But what else was she doing? She was really talking about bringing people together and turning the issue into a common cause that we all have responsibility for. So it's not as if one hero like Superman or Jean-Luc Picard is going to be able to swoop in and exercise leadership for all of us. So leadership, working definition, leadership is that set of actions that brings people together in pursuit of a common purpose. If we extend this just a little bit, I really like this definition, and it served me pretty well in my teaching of students and executives and others around leadership. So it's a process of influencing others to understand and agree about what needs to be done and how to do it, and the process of facilitating individual and collective efforts to accomplish shared objectives. So it's not just about the leader. If we unpack this further, so two very kind of prominent leadership theories that have come into the discourse in the last maybe 10 years are authentic leadership and transformational leadership. And these have both taught us something important. But what I would argue is, while they're ideologically more appealing than leadership theories, based on authority, so both Superman isn't really in an authority structure, but he is a hero. Jean-Luc Picard is in an authority structure. So anyway, authentic and transformational leadership can nonetheless encourage leaders to concentrate more and more power in their own hands. And they place impossible performance expectation on the leader's ability to handle complex issues. So transformational, just briefly, says that the leader needs to be able to exercise idealized influence on others. The leader has to provide inspirational motivation. The leader is subject to, a number of very high demands, like stimulating intellectual creativity. And under authentic leadership, this is much more about the person being self-aware, showing openness. There's nothing wrong with that theory. It's important. But in themselves, they don't tell leaders what to do. And I don't think they tell leaders what to do in a crisis. So Tourish, a colleague of mine in the UK, who actually edits a journal called Leadership, it's a SAGE journal, he has made this argument that neither of these theories, which have been quite compelling, are good enough. And we have been starting to think about this already in leadership theory when we contrast traits to practices, because both of these are really more about traits. The other distinction that we think about is heroic versus post-heroic leadership. And for a little comic relief, one of my students found this and sent it to me. Well, I would have exhibited more leadership qualities if someone would have told me to. So the idea that you still have to take responsibility, you take initiative, you need to act in conditions of uncertainty, these remain. And this fellow needed to be told. So he's not, he's right off the bat, he's not really exhibiting leadership, even though he may well be in the authority position. Not everyone in authority has a good understanding or a good ability to practice leadership necessarily. We're lucky when they do, and luckily very often they do, but not always. So the other piece here from leadership theory is that's starting to emerge, and people are talking about it more in terms of understanding leadership during this crisis, is this distinction of wicked problems. So my colleague, another colleague named Keith Brent, has played with this idea a bit, and others are following it up. He asked the question first, what isn't leadership? So he says, if we look at the kinds of problems that leaders need to deal with, whether a severe crisis like this one or others, we can think of tame problems and wicked problems. So tame problems are more like the puzzle that we talked about earlier. He says this is more the manager's job, okay? Wicked problems are more complicated. There's high complexity, and they might have no stopping point. There's often pressure to act decisively, to treat them as tame, but a really critical point is no one individual can have all the answers. A collective is required. So leadership becomes more about asking the right questions. So people often ask me, what is the difference between management and leadership? And it remains a really important question, because we want our managers to be leaders, and often our leaders have to be managers. But just to kind of overdraw the distinction here, management addresses shorter time spans, the focus is on implementing, there's less novelty and uncertainty. Often you may be dealing with issues that you've already seen, déjà vu, and it answers the how questions. How are we going to go forward on this? Leadership addresses longer term time spans. There's more focus on strategic decisions, more novelty and uncertainty. So I had to ask one of my sons who's studying in France, Vous aidez, is this a real word? I speak French, but it's from France, this term, and it's called an envers. So it reverses déjà vu, and many of you may well know this, but I didn't really know it was called an envers. So vous aidez jadé isn't really a sensible word, but vous aidez is a saying that means we've never seen this before. It's novel. It's uncharted territory. And so here leadership has to answer the why questions. Why are we in this? Okay. The other thing that Grint looks at is critical problems and commanders. So commanders, so we have managers, leaders, and commanders. And in times of crisis, it would be nice to be able to depend on a commander. But even these commanders don't have the answers. So we kind of have to let that go. So critical problems, he says, the problem is self-evident. There's little time for decision-making. So if we think of situations where we know command is very, very important, for example, in a war situation, you know, there's little uncertainty about what needs to be done. The commander can draw on his experience and make a decision. He has to, or she has to, make the decision. But this is also often associated with authoritarianism if we branch it outside of like a war type situation. So commanders provide the answer. Now, an interesting and somewhat dangerous thing here is that because society rewards good crisis managers, commanders might actually reframe situations as crises. They might play up the crisis aspect of a situation so that everybody believes that they do have the answer. That's a fairly dangerous situation. So Keith Grint's model talks about these three authority styles that correspond to the type of problem that people are facing in their decision-making. So a crisis or a critical problem, he puts crisis here, but I'm going to play with that in a moment. That's up to the commander. A tame problem, this lends itself more to managing. A wicked problem calls for leading. So the persuasive account of the problem partly rests in the decision maker's access and preference for particular forms of power. So I'm not going to go into huge detail on this, but I thought it was interesting to show you. And drawing on my last point from the last slide, commanders will paint problems as crises. So if you have a commander style, okay, whether you're a real commander or not, that you've adopted in your leadership lexicon, your leadership, practice, a commander style, you may tend to paint problems as crises. Managers will paint problems as fixable, but herein lies the irony of leadership. It remains the most difficult of approaches and one that decision makers may try to avoid unless compelled by circumstances. The other important thing here is that what he calls critical problems are often associated with coercive compliance. So the commander coerces people to comply. Tame problems are often associated with calculative compliance. Authority can compel, and we run our organizations like this. We do invest authority in the people that run our organizations. It's legitimate authority. We give it to them by virtue of how we structure many of our organizations. But tame problems are often associated with calculative compliance, and wicked problems are associated with normative compliance. So here, when we think about how Canadians, how Manitobans have responded to the pandemic, which is a crisis, so but here we're distinguishing critical problems from wicked problems, which are more like the mysteries that I talked about earlier, okay? Not a perfect fit, but more like the mysteries. These are often associated with normative compliance, and normative compliance is the purview of leadership, okay? Getting people to do what needs to be done in the common interest, to follow a common purpose. So this so-called soft power, which I would argue is not soft in the sense of being easy in any way. It's difficult, it's complex, it takes a huge array of skills and practices and experience and self-learning to exercise well. But this so-called soft power requires higher levels of skill and relational capabilities, what we would call collaborative capabilities. So here we put together this whole model. Keith Grint put this model together, which, and I understand this will be posted. So if you're interested in looking at it further, you will be able to, you'd be extremely welcome to. But he's contrasting here increasing uncertainty about the solution to the problem and increasing requirement for collaborative compliance, okay? And as you go further along those two axes, the X and Y, the need for leadership, asking good questions, but also in a crisis, providing facts to the extent that you have them, being empathetic, and really engaging in those collaborative relational abilities become critical. So I'm going to draw on a few more of those ideas in the remainder of this presentation. And the way I'm going to do that is to introduce two more ideas. One is leadership as adaptive work. And the second one, which I'll show you, which comes from some of my own work with some of my colleagues, is called affiliative leadership. So leadership as adaptive work. So Ron Heifetz, who's at the Harvard School of Government, he argues that leadership as adaptive work consists of actions that bring people together in pursuit of common needs and purpose. Just like we saw earlier in that very first working definition, not the more involved one, but the first one. So I ask, and he asks, what needs? What purpose? I mean, if there are actions that bring people together in pursuit of common needs and purpose, who decides the common needs and purpose, right? The leader needs to be mindful that this is about the common needs and purpose, the shared requirements for action. So it asks first, what are the needs of the community? And Heifetz, quoting him, he says, the toughest and most important task of leadership may be advancing goals and designing strategy that promote adaptive work by everybody who's in the situation, including the leader. Leaders. What requires change and how can we take initiative to pursue it? So this predates the pandemic, but I find it quite useful to think about leadership in a crisis situation. So leadership as adaptive work allows for leadership from multiple positions in a social structure. Both a CEO and a clerk can and must, in a crisis, lead. So the assumption that leaders are born, so Jean-Luc Picard was probably born a leader. I mean, maybe, I don't know, but it's easy to make that assumption. Superman was born a hero, we know that. But the assumption that leaders are born lets both born leaders and not leaders off the hook. Born leaders may waste everyone's time instead of stepping up to the real problems. So if there's someone who assumes that they're a leader, leadership hasn't been granted to them, they assume. Are they going to make the decisions that are in the common interest? Not necessarily. They may waste everyone's time by not stepping up to the real problems. At the same time, not leaders, everyone who says, you know, I'm not a leader, I don't have leadership, they can claim that they had no ability to make a difference. So they escape responsibility for taking action. So these are meant to be provocative thinking points, but they are powerful arguments, and they've influenced new directions in leadership studies. And certainly in my own teaching with my students in the President's Student Leadership Program, with my MBA students, with executive courses that I've taught, I really ask people to think about this very carefully. So, and to think about leadership as practices rather than as traits. A trait is something like how tall you are, your personality traits. Are you an extrovert? Do you talk a lot? Are you very quiet? Those do not map on to the work of leadership as adaptive work, okay? And I think Bonnie Henry is quite an amazing example that helps us to understand this a little bit more. So taking this idea of adaptive work further, I've come up with 4 things that I think change and make this even more important during crisis. What changes during crisis when we think of leadership as adaptive work? Now there may be more than 4 here, but I'm proposing 4 for today as we think about this. So there's acute need for clarity and transparency from those in leadership positions, right? So from those in the leadership positions. There's, I would say, an acute need for forthrightness, for taking a stand, even in the face of limited information. What are we going to do next? What needs to be done? What is the current situation? And we've seen this, I think, from many, many folks around our country who have been giving daily press conferences here in Manitoba. We've seen it from Doug Ford in Ontario. And I remember speaking to friends there early, a month or 2 ago, 6 weeks ago, who were saying how impressed they were by Doug Ford's forthrightness, which was interesting. There's also this idea of hope versus optimism, and I'll explain that in a moment. So leaders can provide hope and should, and improvisation. So improvisation might be the one that seems a little bit less expected, but in the very last part of this presentation, I'm going to explain that. And that maps on to the theory that I've developed with some others called affiliative leadership. Okay. The other point here is when I'm talking in this slide, I'm talking about those leaders who have to talk to us, who we do depend on to help us carry through this crisis. But I think there's leadership evident in our society, certainly in our city or province, that's been exhibited at very many levels, right? In the community, in our healthcare systems, in our businesses, in our schools, at many, many levels by many people. And we've seen the great examples of community-based leadership that bring hope. And they're quite a lot about improvising to help us deal with what we might call radical uncertainty. Certainly if we think back 4, 6, 8 weeks ago. So it's not specific only to the leaders in the leadership positions. So clarity and transparency, going through these 4 one by one, even where information is lacking, we need to, we depend on our leaders to be super clear. And we have seen examples, and you can probably, think of your favorite examples where there hasn't been clarity and maybe there could have been, or where there hasn't been transparency and maybe there could have been. And how that causes anxiety instead of this sense of hope and confidence that we can move forward. On forthrightness, I've got another clip here, and this one is not from COVID. It's not about the pandemic. This man, who you may well recognize, is Mark Miller. He's the Federal Minister of Indigenous Services. And this, I just really like this example in terms of forthrightness. This was, I think, a week ago Friday, in the wake of some awful news regarding RCMP treatment of Indigenous people. So let's take a listen to Mark Miller.
I watched in disgust yesterday a number of these incidents. A car door is not a proper police tactic. It's a disgraceful, dehumanizing, and violent act. I don't understand how someone dies during a wellness check. When I first saw the report, I thought it was some morbid joke. And you look at it and you say, yes, there'll be an independent investigation. But frankly, along with many Canadians, Indigenous peoples living in Canada, politicians, I'm pissed, I'm outraged. There needs to be a full accounting of what has gone on. This is a pattern that keeps repeating itself. I spoke with my team a couple days ago, as a number of them are Indigenous and are feeling the 1 year anniversary of the report in a way that I'll never experience. And the issue of safety came up, and this is something that touches Indigenous peoples in a way that I won't experience it. My team and I saw it. We saw the real fear that was experienced at Tyendinaga, where I felt safe around police forces and they didn't. I can't speak for them. I can't speak for Indigenous peoples, but you can see it. It's palpable. It's painful. I watched.
Yes, I'm sorry. So before I talk to this slide on humankind, some important things I was hearing from Mark Miller were empathy, a collective voice. He's talking about his team. The fact that a dearth of leadership can bring fear. But most of all, what struck me and why I wanted to show you this in this context of my talk was his forthrightness. He's being very forthright, and he's not shying away from expressing his feelings as well as his observations, which can often be important in terms of leadership in crisis. We trust him because he's showing us his feelings and being forthright, which is also what we saw from Bonnie Henry, which is also what we've been seeing from Doug Ford, just to draw on one small example among many, because I referred to him earlier. So there may well be others. But he's talking about we, my team. He's not over-identifying. He's recognizing that people will have different responses. So the next of the four things that I mentioned, I referred to as hope rather than optimism. And I know some of you may well have read this book, or you're looking at this book. I'm not sure if it might be in the book club that Tracy started, but it's called Humankind by Rutger Bregman. And humankind, so what he argues is that, you know, leadership, or in a crisis, or really he's saying much more broadly in our kind of society, often it's not optimism that we need. Optimism is too simple. It might be unrealistic to be super optimistic about everything, right? What we need more than that is a clear-eyed sense of reality, what he calls a new realism. So countering cynicism and seeing a new realism, which he centers on this idea of kindness. And what I'm borrowing from this is the idea of fostering hope, which is the possibility of change. So it's the possibility of change. We can be hopeful leaders. Leadership is hopeful. All of those community leadership activities that we've been seeing, they embody hope. There is hopefulness. So that's our third element. And then our fourth element is improvisation. So again, crisis leadership on multiple levels, I would say, depends on improvisation. And I'd like to, right now, before just moving on, give a shout out to 3 of my students who are helping me on some research projects this summer around leadership, but also precarious work during COVID. And one of them made this slide, so I thought it was super interesting as a picture of improvisation. And the 3 students are Katie Curtis, Ian Demopoulos, and Lindsay Bain. And they've just been great. So I wanted to give them credit for some of the longer term research projects we're doing around this in our James W. Burns Leadership Institute. So improvisation, I mean, what is improvisation anyway? And I won't take too long on this, but I'll say one thing that struck me when I was first thinking about and writing about improvisation in leadership. My mother used to say, okay, it's 5:45. She's got, she's been working all day. She has meetings that night. She has 5 children, various ages, bunch of friends, lots of chaos. And someone calls and says they're coming for dinner that she can't say no to, maybe, a distant relative or something. So she says, hey, let's improvise. We need to improvise. We need to make do with what we have. We need to make the best of what we have. And doing that will release our creativity. Understanding the situation we're in will release our creativity and our ability to innovate collectively through a collaborative kind of process. So improvisation, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but here's some new leadership competencies that may well repeat things that I've already said a few minutes ago, but I've set these out here as things that are really super important and probably take precedence over the command and control type of competencies that we may traditionally think about. All right. Doesn't mean that you don't need courage, initiative. I have foresight here. Foresight isn't the same as clairvoyance, but it is about drawing on the past, drawing on as much information as you can from as many sources as you can, and recognizing ultimately interdependence. So my last element for you is this idea of affiliative leadership. So what we're saying here is that individuals can develop and enact affiliative leadership, which draws power from the interactive processes that embody collaboration. So that's a little bit academic speak, but this is very much about the fact that everyone can do this kind of leadership and that people in our leadership positions also need to be able to do this kind of leadership, especially when uncertainty is high. So there's some 4 main things. Again, the rule of 4, just to condense this for this presentation. Affiliative leadership requires an external focus, an outward focus, away from yourself as the leader, away from yourself at any level, but as a position leader. So it's not about thinking about how you're perceived all the time or thinking about working on your own authenticity in the first instance. If you work on these things, I can guarantee you will be perceived as authentic, okay? But having an external focus, focusing your attention outward to those with whom you're interacting and your environment, not on yourself or your self-consciousness. This is a major skill in collaboration. The second one is being in the moment. So being in the moment recognizes a situation of rapid change, and it's dropping preoccupations with what's going to happen next necessarily to focus on the present interaction, to focus on what others bring to the task, what others bring to your interdependent situation. So it's an ability, being in the moment, focus is an ability to listen and build on others' suggestions. The ability to do that requires being in the moment. Of course, as leaders, you're always thinking about the future, especially in a time of crisis. But if you cannot drop those preoccupations to really focus, what are people bringing together in this moment to help solve this issue, you may miss a lot of critically important information. Okay? So a key idea here is that one person does not have all the information. So closely related to this is the concept of whole listening. So whole listening is attentiveness and alertness to all stimuli. So the ability to recognize and process stimuli in the environment, recognizing the complexity. This is hard, right? So you move from internal focus, thinking, internally, to the external focus in your environment. And listening is a core skill for this, a non-substitutable skill for collaboration and for affiliative leadership. Taking care of your partner. So this concept is, this is a phrase that we use to mean that you're looking after people around you, right? And that you're always mindful of your partner's needs. So your partner can be anyone in your environment. They can be your employees. Your employees can be your partner, your workmates, your schoolmates, your colleagues, your family. Who your partner is depends on the exact situation you're in. But what you're doing is you're not shutting that person or people down. You're understanding that some of the knowledge that's necessary to build a creative, innovative, and interdependent solution depends on maximizing your collaborative capacity. And taking care of your partner does that. So in improv, if some of you have actually, maybe you've engaged in it, but some of this comes from improvisational theater, and we have a whole paper on how to adapt that to organizational leadership. And we actually do some development work around this as well. Improvisation means building on others' work, not necessarily destroying it. So you don't know what the solution is, so you accept all these stimuli in this complex environment. And then you think about how to sort it out, again, together. So taking care of your partner means not dismissing them. So improvisation skills for affiliative leadership, when practiced with others, these are core skills that over time will develop trust within the group, the company, the society, the work group, the classroom, and a willingness to take risks. Working on these collectively, so if you do imagine like a group in an organization working on these, matures the development of trust, okay? And practicing with others builds the confidence and ability to see results. So the other point about affiliative leadership that is quite directly relevant to a pandemic, to leadership in a pandemic situation, is that it involves thinking inside the box instead of outside the box. And here I want to give a very important shout out to my co-author on our paper on affiliative leadership, which is several years old, but we're going to try and develop it further in terms of the pandemic. Rob Nickerson, he's actually an improvisation consultant, actor. He's worked with Fortune 500 companies and with student groups at different levels. He's in Toronto. So he says it's really, really important to think about thinking inside the box. So we have limitations, we have boundaries. We certainly know that. We feel that viscerally during a lockdown, during a situation where we've all agreed through our own compliance, through our normative compliance with you know, what the rules need to be in order for us to stay safe. That's a huge example of thinking inside the box. But being inside that box also allows us to be creative, to be innovative, to make do with what we have. And I think there's lots of cool examples of that as well. So we're thinking inside the box as a first principle rather than outside. This is a little cartoon that I like from the New Yorker. I think it's on a greeting card. You may have seen it before. So this fellow says, never, ever think outside the box. So we're not saying never, ever think outside the box, but we're saying in this situation, in COVID-19, thinking inside the box is a concept, a set of principles and a way of acting from improvisation theory that can really help us and can help our leaders too. So the final kind of key point from affiliative leadership is it's not about me, it's about us. And it's not about only some of us, but all of us. So before I close and take your questions, I just wanted to show you 2 brief slides from our James W. Burns Leadership Institute. So interdisciplinary didn't fit in that box, but our principles, our learning principles in the Institute, which is really an institute for students, first and foremost, both at U of M, but also in some of our programs at the other post-secondary schools around the province. We want to be interdisciplinary, so fostering an ability to learn from multiple perspectives. We want to be inclusive, critically important in our society. And in terms of learning principles for leadership, we try very hard to be immersive. So this goes beyond learning through experience to kind of immerse, well, it is learning through experience, but taking to another level, immersing yourself in situations that you then reflect on and learn from. So we don't necessarily learn from experience. We learn from experience if we can reflect on it and build new theories that teach us how to do the thing better the next time it arises. So learning from experience requires reflection, what did it mean, and new action and new experimentation. And then finally, we have some values for learning leadership, which I'm putting here, and just sharing these with you so that you know a little bit more about our institute. So thank you so much for listening. And I believe the next step is I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and we're going to take some questions. So I see that it's not quite 2, it's 5 to 2 by my clock. And thank you for listening. And I hope there's something you can take away here. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Gagnon. We do have a few questions that have come in, and I will just get started. So the first question is, can you put visionary leadership in perspective with your comments?
Okay. So this is my perspective. This is how I would put that in perspective. The vision doesn't come from one person, okay? So we can't bestow, our formal leaders with the requirement necessarily to set a vision that all of us will buy into. But on the flip side of that, the quality of the vision, I think, will be much higher if it takes into account many multiple perspectives in setting that vision. So leadership is not so much about, hey, follow my vision, let's go, everybody follow me, so much as let's co-create a vision. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. The next one is, I think this might be more of a comment, and then maybe you can just respond to it. Is leadership is the art of influencing human behavior to accomplish a mission or task in the manner so desired by the leader.
Not correct.
Okay.
Leadership, if we see leadership as a normative thing, which is, you know, what it should be, right? If we think of leadership as what it should be, as slightly opposed to what sometimes it is, that might help. So desired by the leader, I would see that as perhaps more akin to management. Okay, I would see that as akin to a situation where the rest of us get off the hook and we you know, imbue the leader as the all-powerful and say, you know, you can decide what's best for us. So I don't think it's a vision desired by the leader. No.
Okay, the next question is, can you clarify affiliative versus collaborative leadership?
Affiliative versus collaborative?
Yes.
Okay. So what we were doing with affiliative leadership is actually there, and there is a whole paper on this. We're building on a number of different ideas from new theory in distributed, shared, and collaborative leadership. And we wanted to give it a new name to center on those 4 qualities that I spoke to you about, which really can be learned. And learning them through improvisation is one way to actually learn those things. So affiliative leadership also has more empathic content than collaborative leadership. So there's a bigger piece that recognizes, you know, it's not about me, it's about us, and not only some of us, but all of us, which has a kind of an empathic content to it. So the leaders don't shy away from showing their feelings and etc. They affiliate with people. So that would be one main way to distinguish it. But they both do, both affiliative and collaborative leadership tell us that, you know, they go back to this issue of whose needs, whose purpose, and that through leadership we're almost always striving for collective outcomes, right? Outcomes that will affect all of us. So whose needs, whose purpose become very important. And Tracy, I should say, I didn't mean to truncate my last answer too much, all right? If I could add to it just briefly, if you are, you know, you're the CEO and, you know, you've developed a vision for your company, you know, you may well want to influence others to follow that. But a very important piece here in our multidisciplinary, rapidly changing world is that your vision may need to shift and change, certainly with uncertain events, unforetold events, right? It may need to shift and change. And you need to be able to take in information from many different sources. And these come from other people. So that's why I was reticent to say, yes, that is a sufficient decision when we're talking about uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thanks for that clarity.
And Tracy, just to also say to everybody who's at home, I don't see any of you, so it's a funny way to interact. It's great. I'm really pleased that we're able to. But it's, yeah, so I'm just stating, I like to see people too. Cheers.
Yes, I know that's an unfortunate part of all of this. It would be nice to see everybody. Okay, another question that has come in is, from what I understand, the GRINT model tries to silo three concepts that need to work together to effectively lead. Did I misunderstand the model? If you're able to comment.
I think GRINT's model is more of it's a high level model that's almost like a contingency model, I would say. So they don't necessarily all need to work together. What the model, but they might, they might in some situations. But I think what the model says is that in situations of critical problems, a command style may well be suitable. So contingent on the situation, one of the styles may be more suitable. In situations where there are tame problems, then a management is sufficient. This is what GRINT is saying. In situations where we have wicked problems, and here others have talked about grand challenges. So, there's this idea of grand challenges where these are large, difficult, complex, indefinite challenges like climate change and others, poverty. These are where leadership, even though it's the most difficult of those three, is really required. So it's more of a contingency model, I would say. And he's just kind of compelling us to think about the distinctions between those three things.
Super, thank you. That's very interesting. Another point was made, as if you'd like to comment, is I suggest that an important leadership skill is ability to identify those impacted and taking them into account. So in this case, example, pandemic and migrant farm workers.
Right.
If you want to comment on that.
It's absolutely important. So I guess the taking care of your partner in this case, that includes farm workers. That includes, everyone who's impacted, right? So it definitely involves that. Yeah. And if I think, so we've got so far transparency and clarity. We've got forthrightness and taking a stand. We've got hope, and we've got improvisation. I'm building it into that improvisation piece, but perhaps certainly in a pandemic, we need another box there, a fifth box. I'm not sure, but absolutely it involves trying to understand the impact. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Here's a very interesting question. Can you comment on our Prime Minister's leadership during this pandemic?
I could give, so I haven't examined our Prime Minister's leadership as a scholar in detail. Of course, I use my lens when I watch the news, but I'm also a citizen like all of you. So I have a lot of my own personal views. Perhaps, can I comment? So I'm not sure that I'm necessarily willing to comment on that. Do you want to have a follow-up?
Sure. I guess maybe is there, you referenced Dr. Bonnie Henry,
Yeah.
right? Of her leadership during this time, and you had cited Doug Ford as well. So
Right.
maybe any other examples of where you're seeing maybe stronger, or I don't know if you want to say less strong leadership during this time of crisis, right?
Right. So yes, I did reference those examples because they're particularly, good and interesting examples. I added Doug Ford because I think empathic affiliative leadership, like we're seeing from Bonnie Henry, which builds, our trust, our ability to not feel fear, et cetera, and is very transparent and is based on the fact. I don't mean to, well, No, I won't even go there. I'll wait for the question. I was going to talk about whether that's rare or not. I'm not sure it's rare. I don't think it's rare. I think we've seen it from many of our political leaders. Certainly there are examples, if we want to go outside of our country, of, you know, very, very negative examples that we don't have to go into. We see it on our news all the time. And in terms of Prime Minister Trudeau, I think what I could say is that he's been consistent. He's been there. It seems to me that he's given a lot of accurate information to the extent that the facts are available. So that has actually been impressive to me. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I see a lot it comes up a lot in my Facebook feed, but an example, if we're looking outside of our country, is, and not just in this crisis, but I think other crises their country has experienced, is the Prime Minister of New Zealand. It's quite interesting. You know, she's very young too. She's a fairly new Prime Minister, but just seeing, I guess, the world response to her style of leadership, and many of them talked about in terms of transparency and whatnot, it's interesting.
It is. It's very interesting. And yeah, people, you know, I could have put her into my slides as well as another example. Chose to focus on Canadian examples. I think she's getting a lot of attention for very, very good reason. And if you remember, prior to the pandemic last year, when there was that horrible shooting on the South Island of New Zealand, and she came, you know, she acted almost immediately on gun control in her country. Now, I'm not saying that's transferable to other countries. I'm not taking a stand on that in any way. She was able to do something that was, you know, doable in her context, and that she believed in, and that others believed in, right? She wasn't, but the speed at which she acted, I think it was at that point that she really started to get onto our radar, to move forward on something in what she saw as the common interests, and the New Zealand people agreed with her on that. She also refused to name the perpetrator of that, and to not give the perpetrator the visibility or the kind of fame that might come with such a horrific act. So those were interesting choices that she made. And I think in COVID, so, you know, definitely, I haven't watched all of her talks or anything like that, but what I have seen and what I have read, very interesting example. You're right, Tracy, definitely.
This next question, I'm going to sort of paraphrase a bit, but from sort of, we've talked about maybe some, you know, positive or distinctive characteristics of leadership, but what about, you know, in terms of systems that are set up maybe authoritatively, right? Like there's a distinct hierarchy in terms of, you know, leadership and reporting structure and whatnot. And what if perhaps there's decisions that are being made that are, you know, could affect trust, whether from management or staff lower down the chain of command, and how is someone who's part of that lower down in the chain able to affect change from within?
Right. That's a wonderful question. And I think it's a complex but important question. So I will throw out a couple of thoughts here, but that really is a question that deserves a lot of attention. And I think no matter where you are in an organization, you're not completely without influence. And so we talk to our students who often enter at lower levels of an organization about influence without authority. So you might not have the formal authority, but you still have influence. And if you look back on my definition of leadership, it is about influencing others, right? through collaborative means. So it is about that. So, you can work to influence change from other places in your organization, unless you're in a super authoritarian work structure, and which happily doesn't apply to many of our organizations. I do teach organizational behavior, and the complexity of this question becomes very important and interesting when we think about organizational politics, and how politically, at different levels of an organization, your scope for action will always be somewhat limited. But what I tell my students is to try and see politics as a positive force. Politics is the art of the possible. And, working through sometimes coalitions, informal coalitions of folks who have a particular view, and bringing those forward in a way that, you're going to be heard, and becomes very, very important in a healthy organization. When we have organization charts in our organizations, I would never pretend that we don't. They're there for a purpose. But in a healthy organization, the hierarchy is listening, right? The hierarchy is listening, and people have channels and scope to speak, and that the hierarchy knows that a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the expertise in their organization comes from the people in the organization. So that might sound a little bit, idealist, but it isn't naive. It isn't naive. If we think of politics as the art of the possible, and I don't mean to play politics in a negative way, I mean to see it as a way of getting things done, and seeing that power can come through influence, and power is not like finite. It's not an end game. You can build on it by working on it at your level through your influence.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very interesting. Another question is, from situational leadership, clarity of decision making is important, i.e. how a decision is ultimately made and by whom. What are your comments on this?
Mm-hmm. I would need to look back at the situational leadership model, which is another contingency model. So it says, participative decision making is suited to certain types of situations where people really want and expect a kind of a semi-democratic system in your workplace. And there's 4 pieces in the situational leadership model. I'm sorry, Tracy, can you just ask me the end question on that again? I got lost in re-describing it to myself. Tracy?
Still, I muted. I muted myself. Okay.
So just the question again, please.
So it's from situational leadership, clarity of decision making is important, i.e. the decision is ultimately made and by whom, and then just
okay. So what decision is ultimately made and by whom? Yes, clarity is critical, right? Clarity is absolutely critical, and if that model teaches us that, that's great. Leaders, hierarchical leaders, do have huge responsibility, right? They do carry, we bestow them in many cases with quite a lot of responsibility, and we expect them to exercise it well. And so if it falls with them to make the decision, right? So the Jacinda Ardern example in New Zealand, she's making decisions. Pierre Trudeau, oh my God, showing my age. Justin Trudeau is making decisions, right? Decision making is happening all the time. And it does require clarity. And it is often the hierarchical leader who takes the heat, who takes the responsibility for ultimately making the decision. So none of this is about taking the decision away. but what are the inputs that you have in making that decision? Is it in the common purpose? Is it for all? In whose interest is it? These are big questions, right? If we're looking at organizational leadership, these are very, very big questions, definitely. But yeah.
What about from the perspective of taking personal responsibility for a poor decision or for a poor result? In terms of examples that you've seen, from particularly a Canadian context, where you've seen really good examples where leaders have taken personal responsibility and then done something as a result, whether they've left the organization or they've invoked some sort of change versus not done that, and what has been the ramifications as a result.
Yes, I mean, I think if we think about crisis, so I'm, my framing today was really more about crisis and situations of radical uncertainty. I think these questions are really, really important and good, but they're broader questions than what I was addressing today. So I do want to say, there are other issues and questions that certainly need to be addressed, many, when we talk about leadership. But if we think about crisis, crises can be caused within an organization. So there might be some serious unethical behavior in your organization that ultimately may accrue to the leader, and that person may well take responsibility. And in order to keep the trust of that organization's stakeholders, their customers, their workers, their funders, their whomever, the leader may well have to resign in those situations, or the responsible person ultimately may well have to resign. And we see that in many cases. We saw that with the Volkswagen case. We saw it in many other cases. So, and certainly if we go beyond organizations to our parliamentary system, there is a principle that may not be followed to the letter, but there is a principle that the minister, right, the elected person, takes responsibility ultimately for a bad decision, like a bad decision that has serious repercussions, right?
Okay. Another question we've received is which one to practice different types of leadership contingent, and subtypes, and new models include affiliative, collaborative, authentic, transformational.
So I'm sorry, Tracy, the very first part of your question.
Well, so which one to practice different? So maybe it says which one to practice different types of leadership, contingent, and said there's 3 subtypes and new models, which could include affiliative, collaborative, authentic.
Okay, so which one to actually use? Yeah, that's a really, really fair question, and I think some of I'm presenting some ideas, but the ideas need to be relevant, and is which one to practice contingent on your situation? I think that's how I would interpret that question. I would suggest, perhaps with some provocation, that there are best practice models of leadership. And if we're talking about a crisis situation, we're talking about the models that go with what Keith Grint called wicked problems, and the model that I'm calling affiliative leadership.
So this might just be a follow-up part of it. Are you taking into account the spectrum of leadership influence behaviors as it relates to individual situations?
Individual, you mean leadership influence behaviors, individual situations. I'm talking about a sense of principles that you could carry into many situations. even a disciplinary situation, okay? So a disciplinary situation, you may have to fall back more on your management hat than your leader hat, right? But your leader hat is still very, very important there. You have some choices to make where, you know, you may be disciplining that person, you know, is that the same as destroying that person, right? So that's one issue that comes to mind. So even though it's very difficult and you might have really different interests and the person maybe has done something, you know, borderline criminal or unethical inside your organization, you know, that would be an extreme situation where I wouldn't expect someone to necessarily be affiliative, okay? But there may be some affiliation around the edges of that, certainly in terms of how you treat people, right? And the messages that you send the rest of your stakeholders.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this is more of a comment and just asking also if where to find more information, but it's paper on improvisation as it relates to collaborative leadership available to alumni. Is there somewhere that we can lead people to, or a link or whatnot? What are your thoughts?
Oh, thank you for that. I have, as I mentioned, a published paper on this. It's from 2012, so it was, it's a few years old. It doesn't seem that old to me, but it is. And in this paper, we go into a lot of leadership theory, but we also go into some of the activities that that can be practiced when you want to develop affiliative leadership. So when you want to teach it to others. So I could make that available. There's I have no concern with that whatsoever. I'm happy to make that available to alumni. If there's an interest going forward in actually undertaking some of this development work, it's very engaging and pretty powerful. So I don't know, Tracy, I guess it would depend on the programming, but the person who I've worked with when I'm teaching this model to students is the man I mentioned earlier, Rob Nickerson, who's the expert in improvisation.
Okay. Thank you. And one last question. This is a question for me as it relates to you were mentioning about the UM Alumni Book Club that we've just launched, and you know talked about various different books. But I'm wondering if you're able to share, you know, sort of what's on your bedside table in terms of the books that we should be looking at whether leadership in general or on crisis leadership as we're talking about today.
Well, I think we need to wait for the next crisis leadership books that will help inform this situation, because I do think it's quite unprecedented, you know, and I'm not an expert on pandemics, but I have read about the history and the other pandemics and influenza, even in the 1957-58 situation, of course, back to 1918. And I do think a very important message that I would probably make to everyone that I should have emphasized earlier is that the interdependence that is part of this crisis, right? Where we are interdependent globally in terms of finding the solution. And, you know, and this really lends itself on a very high level to an affiliative outlook. But, so I'm not sure we have, you know, the next best book on crisis leadership yet. But the book that's in my slides that's called Humankind, I would recommend that one just to put on people's radar right now, Tracy, and I think it would be a great book for the book club. And there's another book that I would recommend that emphasizes the importance of the ability to still see and use power. So we don't pretend that power and power relations and power differentials and all these organizational behavior terms go by the wayside when we talk about a clear-eyed, steely-eyed approach to leadership of the forms that I've been discussing. And this is called Power, a User's Guide. And in fact, I'm drawing a blank on the author, which I know is a little bit crazy. It's not, it's a semi-academic book. It's not a super academic book, and it's called Power, a User's Guide. And I can it's upstairs, or I would go get you the author's name right now. I can look it up on my phone.
Okay. that sounds great. And yeah, always sharing various other sources that we're able to look at for other perspectives is great. So yes, we'll all keep our eyes posted for the next book on crisis leadership, as I'm sure there will be a lot of people who are writing about this very interesting time right now. So
yeah.
Did you did you see it, Suzanne?
Yes, it's written by a woman named Julie Diamond.
Julie Diamond.
And she's had other works before. And it's, it really is very interesting, very clear-eyed consideration of, you know, how we use power. So the question earlier from how do you make change inside your organization? It's a very relevant book for that question.
Absolutely.
And for all of us as citizens, right? Because part of this is also not kind of just letting the leaders do it, right? I'm saying we have a responsibility. Yeah.
Super. Okay, well, thank you very much. Those are all the questions that we have today. So thank you very much for that very interesting, timely, and engaging presentation. And thank you to all of our listeners for participating today. We will be sending you a link to today's session, as well as a survey where you can share your thoughts and your feedback. Please do provide feedback. It's the only way that we are able to improve. In particular, if you have suggestions for other topics, speakers, we would love to hear your thoughts. So next week on June 24th, our speakers will be Dr. Derek Bruin of the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences and Dr. Barry Prentice of the Aspen School of Business. And together they will be speaking on COVID-19 and the Canadian food supply chain. And they've published a number of articles on this, so that will be a very interesting session. So please visit our website to register if you haven't already for this session. And please have a great week and stay safe. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.